Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm speaking against the proposed amendments for Bill C-17, an act to amend the Yukon Environmental and Socio-Economic Assessment Act, or YESSA. This bill seeks to reverse progress in Yukon's economic and natural resources development. For years, Northerners have built and relied on their increasingly thriving economy, unlocking the opportunity and prosperity of their natural resources. And from mining to hunting to tourism, Canada's northern territories are an important and strategic asset to Canada's future. The YESSA became law in 2003, and the goal of that original bill was to develop a single development assessment process for projects on all federal, territorial, and First Nations land in Yukon. Part of the legislation included a mandatory review after 5 years of becoming law. The review was a joint initiative of the Council of Yukon First Nations and the governments of Canada and Yukon, and was completed successfully in March 2012. These changes were formally introduced in Bill S6 in 2014, which intended to make northern regulatory regimes more consistent with those in the south in order to attract investment and expand economic opportunities now and for future generations. The bill, which was called the Yukon and Nunavut Regulatory Improvement Act, amended both YESSA and the Nunavut Waters and Nunavut Surface Rights Tribunal Act. It was part of a broader suite of reforms intended to give Northerners greater control over their resources and to help promote resource development and economic growth. The changes to Nunavut's regulatory regime have not been controversial. Bill S6 reflected many of the jointly agreed upon findings of the 5-year review of YESSA, but also reflected changes to regulatory regimes in the rest of Canada and input from Yukon's government. Bill C-17 proposes to repeal many of the changes enabled by S6. These include removing time limits on the steps in the review process, removing an exemption for projects that have already been approved through the assessment process, removing the ability for the federal minister to provide binding policy direction to the board, and removing the ability to delegate the federal minister's powers, duties, or functions under the Act to the territorial government. At its core, this bill will make natural resources development much more difficult in Yukon for project proponents and investors. It will slow down the review process by increasing the number of projects that need to be reviewed and by removing timelines for approval. It will also damage industry and investment confidence in the regulatory regime. It's a step backwards for the self-determination of Yukoners because it takes away northern control over northern resources and puts it in the hands of federal ministers and of MPs from large southern urban centres. Northerners know their needs and capabilities best, and they should be equipped and empowered to make those decisions for themselves. But Canadians shouldn't be surprised. The Liberals have shown their cards, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally, that prove they are fundamentally anti-Canadian energy and anti-Canadian resource development. This bill is another part of their plan, it seems, to dismantle Canada's successful natural resources development. C-17 brings more uncertainty to the resource development review process that will undermine economic opportunities for all Yukoners. It also introduces new uncertainty for the rest of Canada about whether it's a template for the basis of Liberal policy going forward. I had the amazing opportunity to visit Yukon last summer. Of course, the landscapes are breathtaking, the resources vast, and the people are friendly. But what stood out to me was an almost universal and distinct independent, pioneering, adventurous spirit, and a deep appreciation and abiding love for their land. It's the same can-do streak of Canadian miners, and the most important sector of Yukon's economy is mining. The territory is extremely rich in mineral potential. The main resources mined are gold, which in 2011 accounted for 70% of metal mining, copper, zinc, lead, tungsten, silver, and coal. Yukon has some of the largest iron ore and zinc deposits in the world. There are over 80 mineral resource deposits there with enormous economic potential. Last year, more than $300 million was spent on exploration, and mineral production soared above $400 million from just $46 million in 2006, according to the Yukon Chamber of Mines. The mining sector in Yukon is very successful, but it has challenges. Difficult access and rugged terrain of the territory make it difficult to access many of these deposits. And that's where the federal government can assist, by investing in infrastructure and by making it easier for developers to access resources across the territory, given all of the challenges. Bill C-17 does not make any of it easier. In fact, it will make mining more difficult for many families who have been in the industry for generations. Last fall, the Natural Resources Standing Committee heard from several witnesses during a study on the future of the mining sector in Canada. Mike McDougall is the president of the Klondike Placer Miners Association, and he came to Ottawa representing the 160 family-owned and operated placer mines in Yukon. I'd like to share his thoughts on Bill C-17 with you. He said, quote, "YESSA defines much of how the placer industry's operations are assessed for impacts and how these impacts are mitigated. Placer mining is the single largest client of the Yukon Environmental and Socio-Economic Assessment Board. Issues such as costly and time-consuming reassessments for unchanged projects, inconsistency, and lack of accountability between designated offices, and a lack of clear timelines all leave our industry with uncertainty. The amendments were meant to bring YESSA into line with the other Canadian jurisdictions, provide certainty for investment, and allow Yukon to be competitive. As the government is now prepared to amend this legislation once again, we would like to see these issues addressed in the amended bill. The federal government has heard the concerns of First Nations, and as the #1 client and end user of the YESSA process, the KPMA expects that government will engage with us prior to finalizing any amendments. Mr. McDougall's testimony highlights how uncertainty and ongoing regulatory changes and challenges will hinder their ability to fully engage in northern development, which should be a serious concern to the Liberals since mining is the most important part of Yukon's economy. Putting up more roadblocks and adding more red tape is not the answer. Bill C-17 adds a barrier for investment, as companies are now uncertain as to when a decision will be made. Furthermore, the bill would immediately increase the regulatory burden and major costs for proponents, which will impact many working Yukoners and their families, since mining is a major employer in the territory. This bill will worsen the economic situation in the north by putting thousands out of work. The Liberals claim consultation as a cornerstone of their platform, and they consistently refer to it as an important part of their legislative process. But in this case, stakeholders such as the KPMA, who will be impacted significantly, were not consulted before the changes presented in Bill C-17 were hastily introduced last spring. The Liberals' Ottawa-centric agenda is not working, and worse yet, they aren't listening to those who are and will be worse off because of it. Their promise to simply repeal the controversial sections of S6 is yet another example of how they made promises during the election without considering the consequences. Now they put the Yukon at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of Canada for attracting private investment. Their regulatory changes, though, aren't the only ways they're harming the North. The Liberals' carbon tax burdens Northerners, their businesses, and their families more than any other region in the entire country. People in Northern Territories are already required to pay more in fuel and transportation expenses just to sustain the basic necessities of life and to get essentials to their communities. The carbon tax will victimize people who rely on these services. The Prime Minister said his plan will be good for the economy, good for innovation, and good for jobs, but it's just not true. His carbon tax will cripple industry, hinder the economy, and drive up the cost of living for Northerners. It will also mean Northerners will pay more for food that is already more than 4 times more expensive than the costs anywhere else, along with essential goods and products. Electricity will become unaffordable to communities who don't have any other source but diesel. In the North, the carbon tax is really a tax on living. It's a tax on living. And in a place where home heating and traveling long distance is part of life, Northerners can't afford it, particularly when legislation like Bill C-17 forces further barriers to their most important economic driver, Canada's world-class mining sector. So whether it's higher taxes, more red tape, ongoing uncertainty, the Liberals make it clear that developing Canada's natural resources will be more difficult than ever before everywhere. And at a time when technology, research and development and innovation are at an all-time high, the Liberals are attacking the very people who are ensuring the long-term and sustainable natural resources development in Canada. This bill will not help Yukon, a territory rich in natural beauty, natural resources, and irrepressible human capital. The Liberals are limiting opportunities for future generations and are just adding challenges to the North, and that's why I oppose these amendments. And, Mr. Speaker, there have been consultations, and I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion: that notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House, the sub-amendment and the amendment to the second reading motion of Bill C-17, an act to amend the Yukon Environmental and Socio-Economic Assessment Act, and to make a consequential amendment to another act, respectively standing in the name of the member of Dauphin Swan River Nipoa and the member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake, be deemed negatived on division.
Does the honourable member have unanimous consent of the House to move the motion? Yes. Agreed. Excuse me. The House has heard the terms of the motion. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. Carried. Resuming debate on the main motion. Q&A? Okay, very good. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North. Thank you. No, are there any questions and comments? The honourable member for Yukon, and then we'll go over there.
Thank you, and I appreciate the member's speech. I just wanted to get 2 points on the record that have been improved since a number of these speeches may have been formulated. One is related to timelines. There are actually timelines now in the process, and they're done locally. They're done by the board, and they're gazetted so everyone has their say. So the fear about timelines no longer occurs. And the other is about the reassessments. A new thing put into the bill allows an assessment now to be for longer than just the next license. It could be the life of the project or that, so that you wouldn't have to have a reassessment partway through. So I think these two improvements will reduce some of the concerns that people had about this bill.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Well, I'd like to thank the member for his question. I think that there's a larger issue, though, about the Liberal track record of creating uncertainty and ongoing regulatory changes for natural resources right across the board, whether it's for Yukon or for LNG or for pipelines or for energy development. And I think what's concerning to all of us is I think all members in this House believe in the duty of the Crown to consult and believe in a robust and comprehensive regulatory process balancing local concerns, balancing First Nations concerns, balancing environmental concerns and economic opportunities. So I hope that as we go forward, the Liberals can become more unequivocal about their support for natural resources development right across the board for all Canadians and all of the opportunities and prosperity that it will provide for future generations, and the importance of natural resources development to all of the economies across Canada right now.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik, you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I listened carefully to the speech presented here, and it sounded like the entire Yukon was doomed as I listened to the member's speech, and I'd like an explanation to that, because I know of many regions in this country where there are strict environmental and social assessment rules that exist, and generally economies in those regions go very well. So I'd like her to point to me examples or experiences where these kind of rules exist and that the economies of those regions went bust.
You'll be doing that? The member for Lakeland.
Well, in fact, the track record of Canadian resource development, from LNG to pipelines to oil and gas to mining, is world class. Canada, and Alberta in particular, but Canada in general has long had a track record of the most stringent and rigorous regulatory assessment processes for all kinds of natural resources development, which has always involved consultations with First Nations people, as is the duty of the Crown, and consultations with stakeholders and assessment of economic opportunities, of balancing environmental sustainability. So that is the very thing about Canada, is that we produce natural resources development in the most sustainable and responsible way in the world. And not only do we export needed products to the globe, as well as technology and expertise, we also offer to the world decades-long of track record of exactly how to do regulatory assessments in a way way that is predictable and certain, stimulates economic opportunities, prosperity and jobs for future generations, and unlocks the potential of natural resources development. It's only the left that seems confused about whether or not Canada has a strong regulatory process. We've always have, and we do in mining and all kinds of other energy development.
We have time for about a 30-second question and 30-second answer. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, time goes by so fast, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleagues' comments. There's a litany of basically potential disaster on natural resource development across the way. They're changing the assessment processes. They're bringing uncertainty to both natural resource development and environmental protection, putting political opinion and spin ahead of science. They're actually mocking First Nations residents by refusing to respect transparency laws that are already in place, playing games with people's lives through carbon tax. I'm just wondering if the member can tell me, does she think that the divisiveness that's being caused by this government is going to be more or less than the divisions that were caused by this Prime Minister's father across this country?
The honourable member for Lakeland in 30 seconds or less, please.
The disconnect and the anger at Ottawa from the people that I represent is greater and stronger than it's ever been in my lifetime. And I would say that Prime Minister Trudeau right now is following down the exact same path as Prime Minister Trudeau, his father, this Prime Minister is following down the path of that Prime Minister by pitting regions against regions, sectors against sectors, provinces against provinces, people against people, and I hope that one day they'll actually walk their talk about united Canadians.